The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Michaelsen of Winterborne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Dissidents from Pakistan have long sought refuge from persecution in the liberal West. Sweden, the Netherlands, France and Canada, they have fled to such countries for protection. But the long arm of Pakistan's state security services is reaching into these places of supposed safety. Vocal critics of Pakistan have been attacked, or died in mysterious circumstances. This worrying trend suggests the Pakistani establishment is trying to stifle dissent not only within the country, but also beyond its borders. Engage with our panel of erudite speakers to debate this burning issue, which raises deeply uncomfortable questions for both Pakistan and the West. On 14th July at 2 p.m. UK time. Streaming live on the Democracy Forum's social media channels.
Hello and welcome to our July Democracy Forum debate, where we tackle and explore issues that can often have an impact on all our lives. My name's Humphrey Hawksley. I'm your moderator and chair for the next 2 hours. And this month our title is Political Exiles from Pakistan. Has the West lost the will to protect the freedom to dissent? It's a debate that goes to the heart of Pakistan's character as a country. Why should anyone feel the need to go into exile for their political beliefs? It goes to the heart of the resolve within the democratic world to protect those feeling threatened. And it goes to the heart of the moment as Afghanistan is faltering with the Taliban, it seems, yet again knocking at Kabul's door, a country where Pakistan has much strategic interest and Afghanistan can have much impact. We have a panel of brilliant, highly experienced contributors: Hina Jilani, Pervez Hoodbhoy, Taha, Siddiqui, Marcus Michaelsen, summing up at the heart of, from the British democracy, might be Barry Gardiner, Member of Parliament, but he might also be called away, not least because his constituency of Brent North is the home of Wembley, where the European Cup final happened on Sunday, and there's much post-mortem going on there. We hope to have Barry, but we may not. But first we go to Lord Charles Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, to lay out the canvas on which we're going to debate. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Democracy Forum, I have great pleasure in welcoming you to this webinar, which has been convened in response to the growing evidence of extraterritorial repression of political dissidents. The worrying increase in this activity in recent years not only reflects the systemic erosion of human rights and freedom of expression in several South Asian countries, but also it represents a serious threat to the integrity of our open societies in the West. It's no secret that Pakistan is a major contributor to this trend. And in squaring up to this important issue, I'm delighted that the team at Democracy Forum has been able to assemble, for your undoubted benefit, such an erudite panel of experts. And we're very grateful for their participation. And as always, our panel is moderated by Humphrey Hawksley, and we thank him for agreeing to chair the session today. It's an unfortunate fact that certain nation states have a long and unedifying history of giving themselves the arbitrary authority to threaten and apprehend their dissenting nationals well beyond their borders if necessary, with impunity. Stalin's merciless pursuit of Leon Trotsky to Mexico City in 1940 is perhaps the most infamous use of an ice axe in the history of political exile. But closer to home, we've witnessed the activities of Secret Service operatives representing Eastern European and Russian state repression. Who can forget Georgy Ivanov Markov, the Bulgarian dissident writer, assassinated by a poison-tipped umbrella on Waterloo Bridge in 1978, or Alexander Litvinenko, the British naturalized Russian defector poisoned by polonium in Bloomsbury in 2006. A former officer of the Russian Federal Security Service, it was he who coined the phrase the mafia state, perhaps unaware that such a description would come to define Pakistan. Pakistan's record of protecting and upholding basic human rights and the freedom of expression has long been a source of grave concern. The Committee to Protect Journalists has investigated the deaths of 61 Pakistani journalists working in broadcast and print media over the last 30 years. You may not be surprised to learn that the cause given for the majority of these unfortunate deaths was either murder or dangerous assignment. An annual survey of press freedom in Pakistan by Human Rights Watch has led the Asia director, Brad Adams, to conclude Pakistan's continuing assault on political opponents and free expression has put the country on an increasingly dangerous course, threatening opposition leaders, activists, and journalists who criticize the government is a hallmark of authoritarian rule, not a democracy. In recent months, the level of state aggression against press freedoms appears to have intensified. Issuing a news release on the 28th of May, the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan combined forces with the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists and the Pakistan Bar Council to condemn the government for proposing to enact the Pakistan Media Development Authority Ordinance 2021, the infamous PDMA. In an unmistakably Orwellian twist, this new ordinance will permit Imran Khan's government to repeal all current media-related laws, warning that this surely would destroy all public media as it exists in Pakistan today. The Human Rights Commission concluded this malafide step is another U-turn from the promises made by their Prime Minister to expand freedom of expression before he took the oath of office. This ordinance will further tighten the grip of the government on all forms of media. Well, against this background of unambiguous repression, we need to reassure ourselves that the West neither lacks the will nor the means to censure the Khan government for the deliberate breach of these freedoms. And in a surprisingly trenchant resolution debated by the European Parliament in April, Pakistan was urged to take immediate steps to ensure the safety of journalists, human rights defenders, and faith-based organizations. And furthermore, in a move that seems to have surprised and perhaps alarmed Pakistan, this resolution was made enforceable by the threat to revoke the preferential tariff treatment, the GSP plus status, which Pakistan was granted in 2014, and which extends considerable benefits to its exporters. Currently, the European Union accounts for almost 15% of Pakistan's exports, 78% of which enjoy this preferential tariff status. although it's too early to assume how Pakistan may react if the European Commission implements this resolution, we should not underestimate the economic damage that may result from such a forceful and determined action if it is carried out. Well, I hope you enjoy listening to our panelists today. Please feel free to raise any points for further discussion, if you so wish.
Lord Charles Bruce, thank you very much for that. Pakistan's record of protecting and upholding basic human rights and the freedom of expression has long been a source of grave concern. As Lord Bruce said, please send in your views, your comments, challenge our panelists as you listen to them, challenge your moderator, challenge Democracy Forum, make us think and question our own arguments. That's what this debate is about. And now we're going to begin with Hina Jilani, a pioneering lawyer and pro-democracy campaigner, a leading activist in Pakistan's women's movement and international champion of human rights. She's conducted several cases that have become landmarks in setting human rights standards in Pakistan, and is a co-founder of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan and has numerous international and United Nations associations, and was the recipient of the 2020 Stockholm Human Rights Award last year. One of the many things you said that are so telling is human rights are not embodied and protected by declarations, conventions, or pieces of legislation. They're embodied and protected by people. It is people who go out and claim their rights. It is people who realize their freedoms. I have many questions to ask you, Hina, but for the moment, Hina Jilani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me thank everybody who has organized this very timely discussion, and particularly Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for bringing us together to talk about things which are extremely worrying, and the concerns regarding the repressive policies that the state is adopting, which is increasingly becoming more and more authoritarian. It kind of gives me the fear that while we are still talking about those who have gone into exile because of being political dissenters, human rights defenders, journalists, religious scholars, it has become extremely difficult for us to predict a future for the civil society in this country. And, Lord Bruce has already laid the ground for the whole scenario where the multilateral system is waning, international interventions on human rights have become controversial. And in this environment, this has left people in countries like mine with no choice but to flee when dangers become so imminent that you have no other choice at times. Now, I'm a human rights defender, so my focus is always on having a strong community of human rights in my country, so that we as human rights defenders not only feel secure, that we have people around us. And that is really, my source of comfort, rather than any protection that I get from either the state or otherwise. What worries me most is that this kind of environment that has been created and the kind of repressive policies against freedom of expression, against freedom of religion, against expression of any kind of opinion, against freedom of association, against freedom of assembly, is now forcing people to find better environments for their work, to continue their work. And it is depleting the human rights community in our country. That's my biggest worry. And when I hear of one more colleague from the human rights community having to go into exile, or even if they don't go into exile, they have to kind of go into the background. We really, in many ways, weaken the resistance that the human rights community or the civil society in general can offer to this very repressive form of governance that we have, not now only, but have had it for decades now. The concern that I have is that, when you talk about whether the West has not played the role that it should have played in pressuring states like Pakistan and other states where authoritarianism is growing, then it becomes very difficult to bring about a transformation. I'm not saying that human rights defenders or journalists or lawyers or those who have been trying to challenge the authoritarianism have not had any success. But those successes have been firstly very painful while the struggle was on. And secondly, they have been marginal in contrast to the power that the state has accumulated. And this power is not the power to give protection. The state has no capacity to give protection. What the state has done is to increase its power of control rather than increase its ability to give protection and fulfill its responsibility to protect. And that is one of the reasons why even non-state actors have become much more bold in attacking those who they believe are either politically averse to the narrative that they are putting forward or have different religious beliefs. And this is the reason why I think that in Pakistan, very, very unfortunate events have occurred. For instance, I'll just give you one example. Pakistan has always been a Muslim majority country, but, and Pervez Hoodbhoy will bear me out, that in Pakistan, the non-Muslim minorities population has depleted over the years. And there has been such an exodus of this population that it worries us that we are now becoming a state where a kind of homogeneity is being imposed much more than it ever was before. So there is the diversity is decreasing. And with diversity decreasing, those forces that have the ability to impose religious beliefs are now getting more and more powerful and more influential in terms of policies in this country. I think that also we need to mention the fact that the denial of diversity has in many ways it triggered social conflict in this country, political tensions, and religious divisions. If we look at Pakistan, we have on the one hand the non-state actors who are taking their encouragement from the state to impose religious beliefs on a population that has, even in the direst circumstances during the 80s decade, resisted Talibanization of Pakistan to the extent that Afghanistan suffered. The ability of that civil society is now being eroded more and more because of not just repressive policies and legislation, but because of the practices that the state has encouraged within itself. We talk about repression and policies and legislative endeavors that the current government has undertaken in order to repress the freedom of expression and to harm journalists in the worst way possible. But let us not forget that this is a country which has the most vicious security structures. And the intelligence community in this country has been the foremost perpetrator of human rights violations that have driven people like Karima Baloch, like Sajid Hussain, like Taha Siddiqui, to leave the country, and they were not safe even where they sought asylum or sought some kind of safe haven. So these are some of the issues I think that we need to look at in order to see that there is very little room left for civil society to balance the the powerful role of the state at this time. When I speak about the intelligence community, may I remind you that this country has recently, and this government has recently taken credit for bringing in legislation against disappearances, or bringing in recently a legislation. The Senate has passed a bill on torture. But what do you do with such legislation? As far as enforced disappearances are concerned, these are nameless, faceless people who disappear, and who disappear journalists, who disappear human rights defenders, who disappear political dissenters. No law protects those who have been disappeared and gives no consolation to the families, where you cannot even identify the witness, the perpetrator, or the person who has actually committed the crime. This country is not willing, and no government has ever dared to bring in a law to hold the ISI, for instance, accountable. This is an agency that functions outside of the law. There is no law that gives them, defines their mandate, or in any way makes it possible for accountability to happen. Unless that kind of legislation and that kind of initiative is there, people will always feel insecure. Now, in people who are in exile at this time, I don't think that the West has totally abandoned them. There are several initiatives that have been taken. For instance, the UN has a national plan, a UN plan of action for safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. The special procedures do have a communication mechanism within the UN, and it is fairly effective and powerful in order to raise awareness, and prompt action on cases of human rights violations have been taken. The problem here, of course, is the whole definition of sovereignty. And in the UN, I have always said, this is a multilateral forum where in the human rights system, you are talking to the states about their own shortcomings and expecting them to correct themselves. So these are some of the problems that I think at the international level that need to be rectified if we really want a global environment in which it is possible for those who can pressure governments to respect human rights, to ensure that people are secure, their lives are secure. And it's not possible to do that until and unless there is a redefinition of national sovereignty. I think that's very important. If that sovereignty is going to stand in the way of international action against human rights violations of an extent and of a level where people are forced to flee their own countries and set up in exile. When these people are in exile, you speak to Taha Siddiqui, and he will, I'm sure, tell you of the first-hand experiences. It's not very pleasant to uproot yourself and go and settle down. And then there are other issues that you have to adjust in a totally new environment. There are other repressive policies that you have to confront socially as well as politically as exiles. So these are some of the problems that I think we have all had, but we are also now trying to grapple with it. There are international initiatives that have been taken to, help out, to organize some kind of support services for political exiles, for human rights defenders who are in exile. I know that the Netherlands has very recently contributed 3.5 million euros for the protection of journalists and initiatives in that regard, and UNESCO is supposed to do something about it. But as I said, these endeavors can only have a limited impact. You spoke of GSP earlier. Pakistan is obviously going to lose a lot, but whether there is a commitment by the European countries to exercise their leverage through GSP is another question altogether. I think those people who are watching Pakistan know very well what is happening here. People have been subjected to enforced disappearances. Even human rights defenders like Karima Baloch and Sajid Hussain were killed while they were in exile. And there have been no comprehensive investigations on it or satisfactory investigations on that. So I think these are some of the things that we must stress in our, in our efforts, that while we as human rights defenders are fighting for against repressive and authoritarian trends in our own country, we need the support from the international community. I remember the 80s when the Women's Action Forum had started its movement against the discriminatory laws against Pakistan and the harsh punishments that were being imposed under the religious laws that Ziaul Haq had brought. And I remember in that time we found that in the environment that we were carrying out that movement, there was no freedom of expression, there was no freedom of assembly, there was very little ability to mobilize public opinion. And the reason why we were able to survive that period really was because of the international public pressure that came, and the pressure that came on that military government from outside. So I think it's very important that we get that support in times of crisis. In countries, and it's not just Pakistan, I would say, things are worse in Afghanistan at the moment. But as I speak, I also know that what is going to happen in Afghanistan is not a concern only for the population in Afghanistan. The impact of and the outfall of what happens in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, is also going to be very severe. We are already experiencing more authoritarianism in enforcing and protecting the narrative that the military establishment is putting out. There is glorification of the Taliban in anticipation of Pakistan's role in the post-American period in Afghanistan. So I don't think that this is the time that we can be, sitting back and not calling upon the international community not to just think of, initiatives for peace building in Afghanistan that have failed even before they started, but to also realize that this is a crisis which is going to affect the whole region. And this is going to lead to more and more people to put forward ideas against what the powers that be in Pakistan are proposing, and their expression of opposition to those particular endeavors is going to lead to more and more repression of those handful of people who will have the ability to speak. I'm also at the end going to say a little bit about, the mindset of the intelligence community, the military establishment in Pakistan, and this particular selected government that has, in many ways, abdicated its role to make policy It has already marginalized the parliament. It is standing with the military so that arbitrary decisions on security can be made and implemented. I remember that when during the 80s, when the Afghan policy was being implemented, we were not made privy to it. Nobody knew what the military was up to and what our intelligence community was up to. It is the same situation now. There is no open, open debate on what Pakistan's role should be at this time. Not just with regard to Afghanistan. We never even speak in our parliament about how to bring regional solidarity on human rights and social policy with regard to the strengthening of the civil society. We never have these kind of discussions openly. And it's either just India or Afghanistan, but we forget that South Asia is a region where there are possibilities of initiatives that can bring people together. There can be more trade between them, more exchange of populations from one country to the other. But these are not things that have ever been of concern to the military establishment. And anyone, at the moment I know, and I think Pervez will also have this feeling, those of us who are talking about a different approach towards Afghanistan, we are now under threat. Nobody wants to hear any of us. Our social media is under stress. You've already mentioned the new law that they're trying to bring in so that even those who have endeavored to speak out and make an alternative media for themselves will not be able to propagate any views other than those that the military is putting out at this time. So I do believe that the international community needs to pay attention. I'm not so discouraged as your topic of conversation suggests today. I don't think that the West really has abandoned, its efforts to promote and protect human rights in authoritarian cultures. But I think the West certainly has now other priorities. And their own, perhaps, initiatives have shown them that it has not led to much success when such initiatives have been taken. Nevertheless, like human rights defenders, never give up hope. And I don't think those Western countries who have a genuine commitments towards human rights should give up their efforts to protect and promote human rights globally, and to use whatever leverage they can on nation states that are becoming more and more authoritarian, and openly so. And they've become openly so, I think, mostly because the international community and its solidarity on human rights has weakened. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hina Jilani, for that. Can I pick up on a question that's come in whilst you've been speaking? And could you sum up for us in a nutshell the case of the human rights activist Idris Khatak? Where is he? What's happening with that case?
You see, now it's become very easy for government and the security agencies to pin sedition cases on anyone. Because of their own failures, they have created a sense of panic within the judiciary as well. So when there are cases such as the one that you're mentioning,
Idris Khatak.
Idris Khatak. The court, the minute they hear the word security, they will become less conscious of their role for the protection of human rights and for enforcing constitutionally guarantees for fundamental rights. In Idris Khatak's case, we had some good judgments coming initially from the Peshawar High Court. But then, and for many, many months when this petition was being heard, nobody acknowledged the custody of this person. And then suddenly we hear that he's in military custody and that he's being charged with sedition and he's being tried by a military court. This whole concept of having military courts was rejected long ago in Pakistan, but it has come back, and the Supreme Court is saying nothing about it. And nobody is feeling the outrage of these kind of re-emergence of militarization of justice in this country. So Idris Khattak is under trial. I fear that he has undergone torture. This is something that we fear, and we have heard from his family of the way that he has been treated while in military custody. There is no justice in the military justice system. It is not a system that I would say gives due process or in any way promises a fair trial. So we are worried about this man. And my worry, of course, stems really from the inability of the judiciary to enforce human rights and to have a human rights consciousness.
And just as you were mentioning Afghanistan, and Pakistan and Afghanistan have been sort of tied like this since, well, the Soviet invasion, 1979, 1980, and many of us sort of remember all that going through. And the West has been very much involved with Pakistan swinging backwards and forwards like this, not quite knowing what it is and whose side it's on. Have things got much worse since that, say, 1980? Has that will within Pakistan, within the West, has it accepted what Pakistan is, or is there still a real fight going on?
I think the Pakistan's role is still not something that anybody can predict at this time or trust. And I'm not saying this, but I'm saying what I hear from those who are the relevant actors in this peace process and in the implementation of bringing peace to Afghanistan. At the same time, I think it's also important to remember that this is a different Afghanistan. It is not the Afghanistan of the 1980s. This is an Afghanistan where a civil society has emerged, where there are people who have the urge for democracy, where there are people who have had ample time to experience a time where they have mobilized sufficiently to bring the consciousness of human rights, of awareness, of personal freedoms, of fundamental freedoms of human rights. And I think there will be a resistance to Taliban, which obviously I would laud, but at the same time I fear for those who resist, because there is no one to stand behind them when the force of the Taliban is used against them. I'm already hearing a lot of fear from the women, especially those who are in the civil society, organized civil society, women who are lawyers, who are NGO workers, women who are doing women's rights work. They are already targets, and they will be targets again. And since they have decided to challenge the Talibanization or re-Talibanization of Afghanistan, that is a population that's going to suffer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are now going to stay with us, please, because there are going to be lots more questions, I think, on this issue. And we're now going to go to Professor Pervez Hoodbhoy, who is both a nuclear physicist representing Pakistan in the renowned Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and a democracy activist. Some 30 years ago, you published Islam and Science, a compelling work that analyzed the plight of science in the Islamic world. And then just a month ago, not letting up, you wrote a very hardly argued piece about the interference of religious scholars with school scientific textbooks on the grounds of Islamic morality. Pakistan is not just in reverse gear, you wrote, it is hell-bent upon moving backwards as fast as possible. The kind of mixed up, confused and ignorant generations that curriculum changes will produce in times ahead is absolutely terrifying. Professor Hoodbhoy, welcome. You are in Pakistan at the moment?
I am in Islamabad, and that's as close to Pakistan as you can get.
You are in Islamabad, and you are writing freely and speaking freely, as Hina was. Thank you for being here. You're not in exile. The floor is now yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to Democracy Forum, we're going to get a good discussion today. Actually, listening to Hina, she had such a broad canvas and she covered so much that we could just have the remainder of this on the various points that she broached. But let me just take a couple of them. One was the decrease in religious diversity. So when I was a kid, I was born 3 years after Pakistan. And for the first 20 years of Pakistan, this was a different. In my neighborhood in Karachi, we had a lot of Christians, quite a few Parsis, and there was a Hindu family too, one which had not fled after partition. In my school, there was even a Jew. You can't even imagine that there would be a Jew left in Pakistan today. Today in my neighborhood, former neighborhood, by the way, our house is still standing, it's 100 years old. In that neighborhood, there is no Christian left, and it's now completely homogenized. Well, I spent 40 years teaching at Quaid-e-Azam University here in Islamabad, and then I went off to Lahore and taught at Foreman Christian College. And I thought, well, I'd be able to see immediately who is Christian and who is Muslim. And I found that looking at my class roster, I couldn't. That Christians have changed their names. So you won't find a Joseph anymore. You might find a Yusuf. You won't find a Mary. You might find a Maryam. But this is an indication of how scared minorities are. And what Hina said about how religious diversity has decreased over the decades. In Sindh, it's particularly bad. There was a large fraction of the population that was Hindu, and now that's been depleted, and there have been forcible conversions. There have been Hindu girls who were underage, who've been taken off and forced into becoming Muslims, and when the parents go to court, they're told that it's the girls did it out of their own volition. As a consequence, a lot of Hindus have fled Sindh. They went into India, but then a lot of them returned. And that's the other point that Hina raised, that when you go to another country, you might get security over there, but it's by no means the same thing, and there are serious problems of adaptation. Well, I think all those who flee a country know that things are not going to be the same. Things are going to be very, very different. But let me now focus upon those who have fought for freedom. The exiles who have gone off to other places of the world because they could no longer be tolerated in their own countries. They knew that fighting for freedom, for the right thing, whatever that right thing is, fighting for that right thing is something that they must do, but it brought immense penalties. So at one level, you are marginalized, you are excluded from jobs, you are excluded from being considered, from being part of society in many ways. You're not allowed to publish, maybe you're not allowed on television. All that happens. And I think a lot of those who have left Pakistan have been forced into self-exile. They either found themselves marginalized, or they found it far too dangerous to be there. The lucky ones, the ones who did want to get outside and managed to get outside, I can name so many of them. They are academics like Aisha Siddiqui, who wrote that very bold expose of the army's role in Pakistan's economy, or they could be the bloggers, the 5 bloggers who were tracked down, and then found themselves at the mercy of Pakistan's intelligence services. Among them was Asim Saeed, Waqas Guraya, Salman Haider, a couple of others. And then there are journalists like, we're going to have Taha Siddiqui speak for himself over here, but those are not imaginary fears. They're very, very real fears. And we've seen what's happened with journalists here in Pakistan, in Islamabad for that matter. Yeah, I should say. Look, once upon a time, we used to think that the people who get beat up, the people who disappear, they are in Balochistan. Islamabad is safe. But that's not true anymore. So very recently, we had Asad Ali Tur, and before that, Matiullah Jan, who were just picked up from their houses or their places of work or just while driving. And it was absolutely clear who had picked them up. There wasn't even a shred of doubt, because there's CC camera footage for that. And, there's official denial or there's official silence. Anyway, they're the lucky ones who survived it. But as Hina said, there are ones who have been not so fortunate. Sajid Hussain, who was the editor of the Balochistan Times, mysteriously died in Sweden, or was it Norway? Sweden, I think. Fell into a river. The police said they couldn't find any foul play, which just means that those who killed him have gotten really smart. Or Karima Baloch in Toronto, walking by the waterfront, and although there are guardrails over there, is found in the water. Again, the police cannot find evidence of foul play. Well, there was something there, because when her body was brought back to Pakistan, the authorities wouldn't allow a normal burial. They blocked routes. They did not allow the body to be transported by the way that her family wanted. And at the burial, there was a very restricted number of people who were allowed, when in fact there were thousands, literally thousands, who were clamoring to have a last look at her because she was a well-known person. The utter lack of state sympathy for them. There's not a word. So when some Pakistani gets assaulted, killed anywhere in Britain, in Canada, there's a statement from the government, but there's nothing in this case. Well, these are the political exiles, the ones who actually fought and wanted to make a difference. But there are others who, because of reasons of personal enmity, because today in Pakistan, the way to defeat your rivals is to point a finger at them and say, he or she is a blasphemer. I don't know the number of people who are currently in jails awaiting trial for blasphemy. But I do know of this young man, Junaid Hafiz. He was 23 years old at Bahauddin Zakaria University in Multan, a lecturer who had just done his master's in English literature. And he'd come back with a lot of hopes and expectations of being able to teach in his home city. Some people in his department didn't like him. They said he had objectionable stuff on his Facebook page. He was abducted. Whether the contents of his phone were changed or not, I cannot say. But for 7 years, he was in solitary confinement in jail in Multan. Eventually, under pressure, he was brought before the court, and although the arguments were very, very weak, that's what the lawyers say, yet he was convicted and is now awaiting death. Well, these are the sad facts. There are lots more like that, but let me turn to other things in this. Well, one hopes that people in the rest of the world who are not directly invested in Pakistan, who have a universalistic outlook, who have a humanistic outlook, who care for other human beings, will take up their causes, will say that this is something that flies in the face of humanity. These are cruel crimes against people. It doesn't matter against who. These are, after all, human beings. Why have they been targeted? Now, that's an argument. That's very, very powerful because, look, humans are at one level all the same. Look at our genes, our genetics. They are identical. You might be white, you might be black, you might be you might be from some Amazon tribe or whatever. You might be an Indian, you might be a whatever. But it doesn't matter. We're all members of the human race, the human species. And so there's a natural, this becomes an extremely powerful argument that we've got to have justice for all humans. Okay, but it'll work when we raise our voices for everybody. And so it also means that if you raise your voice for minorities inside Pakistan, you've got to raise your voice for minorities inside India as well, for the Muslims and the Christians who are in India. And, of course, it goes for every country in the world. So there's that issue of fairness which we should never forget. Because you see, at times it seems that things are politically motivated. And obviously there are reasons why some human rights cases get more emphasized than others. I did hear the case of Livichenko and that of Alexei Navalny is another one, or what's going on in Hong Kong. Well, the West doesn't like Russia, it doesn't like China, and so there are dissidents over there. And when that is picked up, there's always the allegation that this is politically motivated. So my contention here is that to make a moral case, that moral case is very powerful, but to make a moral case, you've got to be scrupulously honest in dealing, in speak to everybody without exception. And so you must speak about wrongs done to Muslims, to Hindus, to Christians, to people from Balochistan, but equally people from Kashmir, etc., etc. So that issue of fairness has always got to have priority. there's a lot else to say, but I'm going to conclude by raising this question of whether the United States, Britain, Europe, the West in general, whether it has levers that can do some heavy lifting. Earlier, the case was absolutely clear. I'm referring to Pakistan. Earlier, the case was absolutely clear because Pakistan was deeply indebted for military supplies, for economic relief, for loans, for all kinds of assistance to the United States, to Britain, and to Europe. But now we have another patron, China. And so it would seem as if that dependency has now gone. It's not true. The dependency has been reduced relative to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s. China is becoming important now for Pakistan, but the West still has a lot of leverage. And let me give you some proof of that. The Federal Action Task Force, FATF, that's caused a sea change in terms of which militant groups are allowed to operate in Pakistan. And the situation is totally different from what was, let's say, 10 years ago. FATF has made a huge difference because it brings, these are control mechanisms that Europe, the West, has in its hands, and they are working. So Hafiz Saeed cannot be seen except in perhaps inside his house in Lahore now. Those organizations which used to recruit openly and have their billboards and have their collection boxes in offices, you don't see them anymore. Why? It's because there is the fear of economic penalties, and a lot of trade that Pakistan has is with the West. There's very little actually with China, which is surprising. We do supply some raw materials, but we import a lot more from China than we export to it. And furthermore, there is the issue of the IMF, the preferential tariffs, the interest payments on past loans. So all those make a difference. And so it's very interesting that General Bajwa, who's the chief of army staff, he said in his 8-hour meeting with parliamentarians, he said, look, it's true China's our friend, but we can't afford to let go of the West either. And so here is a perfectly legitimate control instrument that if you terrorize your people, then we're not going to be good friends with you. We're not going to tell the IMF to soften the conditions for you. We're not going to let you be off the hook as far as FATF goes and so forth. And so, to my mind, although these are political instruments, FATF is a political instrument, IMF is a political instrument, but if those instruments are used for moral purposes, for improving the lot of Pakistanis, ordinary Pakistanis, and ordinary Pakistanis want freedom. They don't want military dictatorship. They don't want the army to rule the country. They want democracy. Just ask anybody. And so we want freedom. Everybody wants freedom. And now it's up to the world to make judicious use of whatever levers it has to see that the principles of human justice are applied uniformly, again, I insist, not just to Pakistan, to all countries everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pervez Hoodbhoy. That was fascinating. I mean, your conclusion, if I'm correct in this, is that West has got some muscle, has got some leverage, but it's pure muscle. There isn't any concept that Pakistan as a culture and a nation realizes that it will be a better country if it allowed the freedoms and the religious diversity that you spoke about so poignantly early on. There's no conception amongst the ruling elite and the military that they'd be better off if they let Pakistan democratize.
Well, it's much more important to see how people look at it. And I'd say that certainly in Balochistan,
people don't have power. The power is with the military that pick up journalists and human rights activists on the street and throw them into jail.
I don't deny what you're saying, but on the other hand, it's our first job is to convince people about that diversity is a good thing, that you must allow for contrary opinions, but also belief systems that are different. Now look, what happened yesterday is an example of that. I don't think it was ordered by the government itself, but textbooks which had a picture of Malala in them were seized and then taken away.
Malala,
I think that
is Malala who got shot by the Taliban. The schoolgirl who got shot by the Taliban.
Yeah. I mean, she was I think a 14-year-old girl at that point, and what she done wrong? Why is it wrong to have her picture in a textbook? But that was the doing of some people in the education department who were outraged by this. And look, this didn't inspire an outrage on social media. In fact, a lot of people are saying, yeah, what she done. So our job, look, it's wrong to say that it's just the state. We have a double fight over here. There are the people of Punjab who have been brought up on a reactionary ideology, and they have been influenced by the educational curriculum. This is not true as much for the people of Sindh or of Balochistan, and I'd say even to an extent the people of KPK or NWFP as it was known earlier. So our fight is certainly with the state, but also...
So this is an internal fight as much as it is the West's responsibility. It's Pakistan's responsibility, really, to sort this out. I'm going to come back to you at the end because you've raised a lot of good points. I just want to point out to the audience here that Hina Jilani and Pervez Hoodbhoy have been speaking us to from Islamabad and Lahore. And I think, Pervez, in a fairly free way, have you held back on anything you've said, or so that you don't get forced to work somewhere?
No, I think let's wait for the questions to come in and let's go by that.
Okay. Because now we're going to our next panelist is in exile. Taha Siddiqui is an award-winning Pakistani journalist and has been living in exile for the past 3 years, I think. Is it, Taha, after surviving a kidnapping and a possible assassination attempt? Last year, you and your wife, Sarah Vrije, launched Dissident Club, which is a bar and cafe in Paris that brings dissidents all around the world together in similar situations for discussion, debate, and support. You didn't begin your career as an activist or even as a political journalist, but as a financial analyst for CNBC. Am I right in that? But you realized that that finance existed in a wider world, and you switched to political reporting, ended up working for the France 24 network, which is when you were told by the military, by military contacts, that you were beginning to cross their red lines. And there's an ongoing joke, let's take a selfie with Taha because it might be his last. So you, in a way, are the embodiment then of this debate. You're in exile in Paris. Has the West lost the will to protect freedom from dissent? Taha Siddiqui, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you for having me and giving me this chance to speak. I'll probably focus more on my own sort of personal experiences as you highlighted, in the sense that because of the fact that I am myself in exile, I would like to go and explain a few little things that perhaps the previous speakers, Pervez Hoodbhoy or Hina Jilani, were talking about what the situation is in Pakistan. They talked about a few of the exile cases. One of the things that we have to remember is that exile for me right now, for example, means exile for me, my wife, and my son. But it does not mean exile for my family, which continues to live in Pakistan, my extended family network. That includes my parents, my in-laws, my brothers and sister, and other relatives in Pakistan. And since the last 3 years, since I have left the country and have been very vocal internationally, speaking at different places, I continue to write internationally in different papers in the West, and I continue to manage a website which focuses on Pakistani news and underreported stories from there. And since the last 3 years that I've been doing this, repeatedly, my family, my parents who live in Karachi, have been have gotten visits from the ISI. They continue to be harassed by the ISI. As recent as 6-7 weeks ago, some people came to my parents' house, even though my father continues to say sort of that we do not have any contact with Taha. But in some of the recent visits, the ISI officials basically asked him to come into a safe house where he was interrogated and grilled by a brigadier from the military for at least 2 to 3 hours, and we did not know if he was going to come back or not, because once you go into a safe house, the military runs those safe houses all across Pakistan, these secret safe houses, secret prisons, and then if you go into one of them, you may not come back. But thankfully, my father came back. But the brigadier that he met there from the ISI, who introduced himself as from the ISI, said that Taha thinks that he is in exile. He's in France, but you are all here. And what if something happens to you? So those were direct threats to him and to my family in Pakistan. So that continues to happen. So exile may mean safety for me, but does not mean safety for all of the family, which continues to live there and does not want to leave Pakistan because they perhaps don't have the same sort of activism that I've been involved with, or they don't want to take the route that I took. I mean, of course, when I was in Pakistan, I had all those sort of, I had to think about it, going into exile, whether or not it was a good choice or not. But in 2018, when it happened, when the attack happened on me, after that, I met with several legislators, several parliamentarians invited me over. The leader of the opposition at that time, Khurshid Shah from People's Party, invited me. Then Ehsan Iqbal, who was the interior minister of the country, invited me, and all of them said that I should apologize to the military, keep my head down, and be strategic about it, and which I did not want to do. And I was like, I was not the one who did something wrong. I was actually wronged myself. So I decided that I would leave the country and go abroad. And now that I'm abroad, my family back home is continuing to be threatened like that. And even not just my family, very recently, my in-laws, my wife's family, they were contacted, and they got visits from the intelligence officials asking about me, just harassment, intimidation, and then saying that if Taha is in France, something can happen to you here. But also in recently, they've even mentioned the fact that we can reach him there, and upon which we discussed these two cases earlier of Karima Baloch. We discussed the case of Sajid Hussain. Both of those cases, the mysterious deaths of them, one in Sweden and one in Canada, they happened in a very similar fashion. Their bodies were found in a water body, one in a river, one in the lake, and we don't know what happened prior to them going missing. So in both cases, the police here said that they ruled out foul play, but as Pervez mentioned very rightly, that the intelligence networks do not leave footprints like that. They would not they're getting smart about how things are done, and that's what we've seen with other countries also in Europe and the West. Other countries have done sort of creative ways of targeting dissidents in exile, using local mafias, using local criminal networks, or directly even intervening in some cases, as we've seen in the case of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul in 2018. So in that sense, exile might be safe personally for me in some ways. It might be safer for me, rather, I would say, but it's not absolute safety. And here we come to the point of how does the West behave, or how does the West react? So in 2018, I would again give a personal example of myself. And in 2018, I left Pakistan and moved to France. The idea was that I would live here for some time. I would see how things are back home, because at that time it was the election year. So the idea was that after election, I'd probably see how things are, and if they calm down, I'd probably return. But at that moment, I went to the United States for a conference. I was invited to speak in Washington, D.C. And on the sidelines of this conference, I was contacted by the local intelligence agencies in the U.S. And they basically reached out to me because they wanted to share some information with me. When I met them, they told me that basically they had intercepted some communication from Pakistan, originating from Pakistan, which talked about an assassination list of exiled dissidents, and it talked about targeting dissidents like me or journalists like me. I know on this list there are some academics who are in exile. There are some other activists, social media activists, which are on this list. And the intelligence agency, the U.S. intelligence agency, told me that it is better that they told me that do not go back to Pakistan. Then they advised me not to go to any Pakistan-friendly countries, like them in the Middle East or China, for that matter. And then they also told me that I should be safe in Paris. I should be careful in Paris. And ever since then, I've been also in touch with the French authorities here, and they have told me to be careful here, because at the end of the day, I'm in exile, and sometimes in exile, you want to connect with Pakistanis, you want to connect with people from back home, but I've been told strictly not to meet Pakistanis here, not to talk to Pakistanis here, not to have a relationship with Pakistanis, because it can be suspicious. I mean, they can be they could have a malicious intent behind their meeting with me. So in that sense, even in Paris, and for that matter, in Paris, for example, just this year, in April this year, a blogger and a journalist from Azerbaijan, he was targeted by some local gangsters, but apparently the Azerbaijan government was behind it. Before that, we've also seen in 2013 in Paris, 3 Kurdish dissidents were killed by the Turkish intelligence officer, by the Turkish intelligence agency. So in that sense, exile to some people might look safe. Exile might seem, there are also those, the problems of of moving, of readjusting, of being able to explain, for example, to explain to my 4.5-year-old when we moved to France, to explain him what exile means, why we can't go back home, why we have to leave home, all of that. Those are those personal challenges that you go through. But at the same time, there are these challenges that you go through because of the the physical safety of yours, or the physical safety of your family back home, and that continues to be a constant threat, constant sort of stress factor even in exile. And the visits that the ISI, the intelligence officials, have been doing at my parents' house in Karachi or in Lahore at my in-laws, they've been saying that they have these big files on me, and these big files with what my tweets, my articles that I write, my YouTube videos of links. Maybe perhaps this video will become part of their record, and they keep saying to my family back home that I should stop this, or otherwise something will happen to them or to me. So I'm always on the watch in that way. And as you mentioned in the beginning, now I run a place called the Dissident Club in Paris, which is a bar and a cafe. It's an intellectual project that we launched with my wife, and the idea is to gather dissidents and dissidents from around the world. And I do a lot of events on different parts of the world. We did something on Afghanistan just yesterday. Before we did something on Egypt. We've done something on China, and we do talk about oppressive regimes around the world. And I've realized that even at this particular spot, I have I've had surveillance from the Pakistan embassy. I've had surveillance from the Chinese embassy. I've had Chinese embassy officials coming to me and repeatedly coming to the bar and saying, we're just here to check out the place. But of course, they're not there to just check out the place. They're there to send a message to me to be watchful that the Chinese are watching me. Or, for example, the Pakistan embassy officials people connected to the Pakistan embassy officials coming to the bar and noting down all the contacts, taking photos. And after all, it's an open door policy that I have. Anyone is welcome to the place. It's an intellectual place. You're most welcome to come and listen to talk and have some food and drinks with it. And the idea is to mix people together like that. But because of that open door policy, I am subjected to surveillance even in Paris. And this is where I would like to bring in the idea of what the West is doing, and if the West is doing enough or not. I think the West is definitely out there trying its best in some ways to protect dissidents in exile, but at the same time, it's not doing enough. For example, in my case, or in many of the other cases, we've been given an exile status. We've been given the proper documentation. All of those things went really fast for me because of my case was quite public. Everybody had reported it. Here in France, the biggest newspaper called Le Monde had done a story about my attack. So after that, my case went really fast. But on paper also, I got everything, but many people don't get that. So that's another issue. But in my case, all of that was good. But for example, I know of another case in the US of Gulala Ismail, who is right now in the US. Her father, again, is being persecuted back home for her activism. And Gulala Ismail's case of exile, of getting political refugee status, that met a lot of hurdles because she had terrorism charges against her back home, but those were fake or fabricated terrorism charges. So in that sense, the West needs to sort of look at how Pakistan uses laws against dissidents and should not make them continue to live in trauma. That happens a lot with the Baloch exiled dissidents. In case of Karima Baloch, for example, when she moved to Canada in 2015, Canada stalled her case of her application for 2-3 years, and then eventually, due to public pressure and the stories about Karima, they granted her asylum. But before that, they were resisting that, and then eventually when she was found dead suspiciously, they didn't investigate it properly. They just left the matter as it is, and it's because at times people like us, people who are in exile, we don't sometimes have that kind of political capital, because we're another another state, or another citizen of another state. We're here just taking refuge, and many countries do not want to get involved in that diplomatic issue of going after something like this, like Karima Baloch's case or Sajid Hussein's case, because it might uncover and unearth some uncomfortable truths, and it might affect the diplomatic relations. And that's the problem that I see when it comes to the West, is that the West has human rights principles that it advocates, that it talks about, and we've learned about them from the Western democracies. But at the same time, we've seen that over the last many years, these human rights values have been traded and exchanged for economic interests, for geopolitical interests. In the case of United States, in the case of United Kingdom, for example, even when we were talking about minorities earlier on, about minorities going into exile, which is another whole thing. I mean, I'm in exile because of my intellectual freedom. Minorities go into exile because they just can't live. They're being targeted all the time in Pakistan by non-state, not just by the state. And in the case of Asia Bibi, who spent 10 years wrongfully in jail in Pakistan, and despite that, when she wanted to get out of the country, many of the European and Western countries were not willing to take her in. The United Kingdom was not willing to take her in. In Europe, many countries, we were in touch with many of these different embassies and different diplomats, because I know the family really well, and I was getting information where the Western countries were saying, no, she will cause chaos and she will cause problems, so we don't want that. And then eventually Canada granted her entry and asylum, and even there in Canada, she's been restricted to speak. She's been restricted to talk to media, not to make, from what we understand, from what we've heard. So in that sense, I mean, the West should definitely reconsider its sort of role when it comes to its sort of interests, and should it trade in human rights values with economic interests, with geopolitical interests, because and Pakistan does that really well. Pakistan, because of its geostrategic position next to China, next to Iran, next to Afghanistan, it plays that card where it plays a proxy, a rental state of different countries. The United States, for the longest time, has been giving Pakistan military aid, civilian aid, and not holding it accountable for its human rights abuses, and at the same time looking away. Now, for example, we're hearing that there seems to be some kind of a breakup in the relationship, but that's I believe that would be temporary, because Pakistan and the US have been in collusion for a very long time, and the US needs Pakistan against China or against Iran, for that matter, and in Afghanistan right now. So these countries in the West, they need to reconsider and reevaluate this, and they need to look at the fact that human rights values matter more than these geostrategic interests or these economic interests, and they need to focus on that, and they need to make us feel, exiled dissidents like us, make us feel like we're not just protected on paper, but we're protected in real. For example, when we have cases like of Karima Baloch, when we have cases like of Sajid Hussain, when we have cases, in my case, with surveillance that I've seen at the Dissident Club, or there was a social media activist who was beaten up in Netherlands from Pakistan, exiled social media activist. All of these cases, after that, they trace back to the Pakistan embassy, to the Pakistani missions. Why are Pakistani missions being allowed to be, why are they hosting intelligence officials who are involved in such such nefarious activities, in such malicious activities on foreign soil. Some action needs to be taken. Some action needs to be taken against these embassies, which are acting as not diplomatic missions, but actually as an extension of the Pakistani military security establishment. I think, for example, France or the UK or the United States or Canada, for that matter, or Sweden, for that matter, needs to send a stronger message than just condemning it on paper or for performative reasons and adding to the rhetoric, but actually ensure that these people should be expelled. Pakistani missions, if they're involved in such activities, and we have given evidence to Western governments of such activities of Pakistani embassy officials, and that needs to be done. So a lot more needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. That was a really very detailed and fascinating explanation. What line do you think you crossed? Did you have a specific story with a piece of intelligence or classified information or something, or was it just generally the way you were writing your stories?
Well, actually, basically, the threat started with a story I did for the New York Times in 2014 or 15, I think it is. So it was a few years before I went into exile. And that story was about secret military prisons and how militants were being suspected militants were being killed in these secret military prisons, and I uncovered around 200 to 300 cases of that. That story got published on the front page of the New York Times, and after that, I started getting direct and serious threats. But then overall, I mean, it was it added on. I mean, there was that story. Then I used to work for France 24. I used to work with the Guardian, and I was also very active on social media, where I was speaking very freely. So in 2017, I had a case about cybercrime and counterterrorism against me, and the late Asma Jahangir, we filed a petition with her at the Islamabad High Court challenging that arrest warrant for me for cybercrime and counterterrorism. And when I asked the officials, I was like, what do you have a problem with? Can you specifically tell me what exactly is it that is problematic, and we can discuss it? They were more or less were not forthcoming, and they just said it's the overall things that you do. We need to talk about it. We need to stop it. So over time, it started with specific stories, but over time it became everything that I did and everything I said. I mean, I would tweet and minutes later I would get calls from a sitting brigadier in the military, telling me to take off my tweets, or else, I would meet consequences. So it became overwhelming at the end. And then, of course, in 2017, the case against me, I went into court. And then once I went into court, they were decided, okay, this guy doesn't want to stop, or doesn't want to he wants to continue doing what he's doing. So then they tried to kidnap and kill me. And that was it. So I decided that was the red line they had crossed, and I had to leave. But the biggest problem is in Pakistan right now is that, and I think there's a method to this madness, because they allow some people to continue to speak and say whatever, and some people not, and we never know what are the red lines you're crossing. They're so blurry, and that creates this sense of fear, sense of confusion, and a sense of self-censorship, because you never know what you might say trigger it. So because of that, we see so much of self-censorship in Pakistan, and then we sometimes see some people being vocal to some extent, and then things go bad for them also. So we're always on the lookout for people like Pervez Hoodbhoy, people like Hina Jilani, who are still in the country. We're very concerned that things what Pervez said today, or things what Hina said today, that could trigger it. We never know.
I see that it's a dire situation, but also on their side, what you were saying about using their embassies and the intelligence operatives from their embassies to threaten you in Paris and surveil you in Paris is also, would you say, is a red line as far as the West is concerned? They should tell them that this is a red line. Once you cross this, these diplomats get expelled.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I think we've seen that happening in cases of Iran, for example. We've seen that happening in case of Russia, for example. But for example, in case of China, we don't see that happening. In case of Pakistan, we don't see that happening. In case of Turkey, sometimes we don't see that happening. I think, and why does it happen with Iran or Russia? It's because, again, there's this geopolitical sort of, geopolitics involved, and Iran is the big bad sort of evil, which of course it has its problems, but other countries also have that, so there needs to be a stronger message sent to all countries and all embassies that this will not be tolerated on foreign soil, especially when evidence has been given to them, when things are shared with them. I mean, in my case, for example, I know the person who did surveillance. He continues to live here in Paris. I know the embassy official from Chinese embassy official who came to my bar to do surveillance, where he continues to. I even reported these cases to the authorities. And then in the case of Karima Baloch or Sajid Hussain, what happened? Nothing. So that sort of makes us rethink about what are the West priorities of the West.
Because that is a very clear. Just before I let you go, but you mustn't go because we need you for the Q&A. Prashant Kumar, did General Pervez Musharraf 2018 comment in an interview when he said Pakistan needs to get over its passive diplomacy and adopt a proactive diplomacy? Did that give carte blanche to what we're discussing? Did he, or was it going on before that? I mean,
well, definitely. Pervez Musharraf spoke about it, and then he gave examples of other intelligence agencies doing that, and he said that in an interview that we should do this, and ever since then, I mean, this is not just him. Actually, back in the early 2000s, there was another minister who said that we can give $5,000 to $10,000 to anyone and take out anyone anywhere in the world. On record again, that was a government minister under Musharraf's regime at that time saying that. So repeatedly we've seen this kind of messaging and communication coming out of Pakistan privately. My family's been told that. I know other cases of families who are in exile, whose family back home have been told that. So definitely, I mean, there's always that danger, and statements like by General Musharraf
doesn't help.
Prove that.
It sort of encourages and bolsters and people to do things. I'm going to leave that fascinating topic here. In fact, it's not so much leave it because we're moving it on with Dr. Marcus Michaelsen, who is neither an exile or an activist, but he is an expert on digital networks, surveillance, and how authoritarian regimes bring technology to bear against international activist networks. It's like watching the Dissidents Club. Marcus holds a PhD in media and communications and a master's in Middle Eastern studies. He's an expert in the digital reach of authoritarianism in our modern age. This is your topic, Dr. Marcus Michaelsen. The screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction and for having me. I'm honored to join this panel of esteemed speakers, which, as you pointed out, connects directly to my current research interests, but it connects also to a personal memory, which I'm very fond of because I've spent some time ago several years in Pakistan, in Islamabad, and I like to remember this period very much. So there are two reasons for me being honored to join this panel. In my contribution, I thought to give you some broader insights into this phenomenon of transnational repression, so which describes the attempts of repressive regimes, of authoritarian regimes, to reach across borders in order to control, silence, and punish dissent from exiles or members of the diaspora. As Lord Bruce pointed out in the introduction, transnational repression is not new, but it has certainly increased in recent years in scope and intensity. So we have a recent report by Freedom House, which covers the years from 2014 to 2020, and they document more than 600 cases of direct physical repression committed by 31 origin states against their exiles in 79 host countries. So this is very much a global phenomenon. And direct physical repression describes methods such as detention, assault, physical intimidation, deportation, or the most blatant method, if you want, assassination attempts, or suspected assassinations. And these direct methods are embedded into a much broader set of subtle tactics that exiles experience in their daily routines. And Taha Siddiqui has already highlighted quite a lot of them. So we speak of surveillance, online harassment, threats from embassy staff, threats against family members in the home country, property confiscations also, or the cancellation of passports. And there's a whole range of countries engaging in acts of repression against their populations abroad. We have China with its global campaign against the Uyghurs minority. We have Saudi Arabia targeting journalists and dissidents, Rwanda going after former government insiders, or Turkey hunting down critics of President Erdogan. Excuse me. And Pakistan is, of course, a very relevant case in this list. So what are the reasons for this remarkable outreach of repressive regimes across borders? I would say, in a way, our ideas of authoritarian regimes are still shaped by the Berlin Wall or the Iron Curtain. But today's dictators no longer hide behind walls. They are embedded in a global system, and they had to find answers to the flows of information and of people across borders. And today, if people leave their country for political or economic reasons, they stay easily connected to their homeland, and they participate in its political and social affairs. And digital technologies especially enable journalists and human rights defenders to have a voice from afar and to mobilize for political change, to raise international awareness on rights violations in their home country. And regimes feel threatened by these external influences. Exiles can channel dangerous ideas of democratization and human rights back home. They can influence the international environment in ways that contradict regime interests, for instance, by increasing international pressure for more transparency and accountability. And because of this intensified involvement of diaspora communities, regimes try to control the activities of their populations abroad. And globalization has also given them better opportunities to do so. So the very same technologies that allow exiles to stay involved also help regimes to extend their reach across borders. Digital technologies are now an essential element in all forms of transnational repression. So with the help of social media, state actors can monitor political activity in the diaspora more easily and with a much greater scope. And in addition to this simple monitoring, we also see more aggressive forms of targeted surveillance. So government agents try to get into the devices or accounts of activists to spy on them. And increasingly, we see also advanced commercial spyware that is used for these purposes. And other digital threats include online harassment and smear campaigns, the use of false and distorted information, and trolls on social media that manipulate online debates. And with this toolkit already, governments are able to pressure activists into self-censorship, to undermine their ties to the home country, and to put them under tension and stress. And then they can easily escalate these digital threats into more direct methods of repression and go after their families in the home country, or send somebody from the embassy, as Taha Siddiqui has described already. And to give you another example of how authoritarian rulers exploit global networks for repression, we can also bring up the manipulation of the Interpol system. Governments who go after their exiles issue so-called red notices, so arrest warrants against dissidents abroad. And if these red notices are not properly checked, which is often the case, the person gets arrested by the police of another country with the risk of being returned or to their origin country, where they face imprisonment or even worse. And authoritarian rulers also benefit from the increasingly strict migration systems of Western democracies, because these systems are more and more geared towards keeping migrants out, and they can be manipulated to get a political immigrant detained or trigger some deportation mechanisms, or slow down their whole file, their case, their application for asylum. So all this shows, and this will be my final point, that host states of immigrants are deeply implicated and entangled in practices of repression across borders. Authorities often fail to recognize tactics of transnational repression. The surveillance technology that is used to spy on dissidents is produced and sold by companies based in Europe or other Western countries, and often governments fail to give a firm response to threats against dissidents on their territory, because they think it concerns some foreigners only and we still have too little understanding of how host states, the context of host states contributes and facilitates transnational repression. Therefore, it is really great that we take up this topic here for discussion. Thank you very much. This is from my side.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm not going to let you go quite quickly. We're going to Q&A after this, but I just want to get a picture of this rather dystopian world that you painted here, which is obviously totally different to, say, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, because the technology is such as it is. And the question we have on this debate is, has the West lost the will to protect freedom to dissent? Now, we've got, for example, the Five Eyes network, which is a massive data collecting thing. We had Taha's account there of being tipped off by American intelligence agencies of possibly a plot against him. Could they do more? Could the West do more with its technology to stop, say, the Pakistan government tapping into my computer and your computer and everybody's computer that's taking part in this debate to intimidate us and threaten us? Could they do more, or is simply the technological power not there?
Yeah, they certainly could do more, but not in a way that I would now encourage our intelligence services to do, or the Western intelligence services to do more spying even on other people. But I think so the surveillance practices of the West somehow set a normative standard for other people to follow, and it's Western practices of going after suspected terrorists in Pakistan, for instance, or in other countries of the world. So reaching out across borders violently, that eroded these international human rights standards, and that encouraged authoritarian regimes to do the same, to go after people they often label as terrorists. So the West could do more to repair these norms again, and also signaling that this is not only, I'm saying only because it's often the perception of Western governments, it's not about one human rights defender or a dissident who's here in exile, so a foreign national, but it's about our liberal values, about protecting our ideas of free speech. These people have come here to take refuge.
I think I just want to nail you down a little closer on this.
All right.
Talking, is it the governments? I talked about the Five Eyes, and that huge sort of government power that's there, or is it the social media companies that where they're being hauled in all the time? They were being hauled in over the Euro 2020 violence that was taking place and the racism that was taking place there. Are they also platforms in which authoritarian regimes can intimidate people like you and me and the people on this panel?
Sure. Yeah. They also have a lot of responsibility, because we have cases of disinformation campaigns or threats against dissident media, alternative media, exiled media in countries like Azerbaijan and Facebook, because it simply didn't deem Azerbaijan important enough as a market, didn't do anything about it. So there were recent reports about this. So of course, the platforms, the private companies that sell surveillance technology, they have a great responsibility, and governments should hold them up to this responsibility.
Got to hold them. Thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to open it up for a key question and answer session. Firstly, though, Abdullah Dio would like to take this opportunity to wish Pervez Hoodbhoy a happy 71st birthday. If that's correct, shall we all wish you a happy 71st birthday today? And now,
too thrilled about it. It's an odd number, and it's a prime number. And I don't know whether I feel more odd or whether I should feel in my prime.
Well, after because it's your birthday, after we've done the round of the key question I want to ask, I have a special question for you, Pervez, to finish us off. But I would like to go around the panel as we began with Hina, and just ask that question again. Has the West lost the will to protect freedom of dissent? And add on to it, in a nutshell, what do you want the West to do now to help protect that freedom of dissent? Just a couple of minutes each. Hina Jilani.
I think we've already said it. We do know that it is important for the international community and the West in particular to make sure that their commitment to human rights, if it's genuine, should be constant and sustained. And for that, they have to use whatever possible leverage they have on these repressive governments in order that they are able to bring some pressure on them, step back from the kind of repression that people like Taha and others who have had to leave their country and flee for their lives have had to do. I think it is possible to do it. Pervez mentioned the FATF. Now, here I know that the international community has been very keen on putting pressures where it's their interest, counterterrorism, etc. But when it comes to the protection of fundamental freedoms, protection of human rights defenders, more sympathy and more support for the civil society, that has not been as strong as we would have liked it to be. There are diplomatic missions in our countries who know exactly what's going on, and yet, for instance, the Europeans, diplomats over here, nothing is hidden from them. And yet we have not seen the kind of strong pressure that we would have wanted Brussels to apply, for instance, on the GSP. And so I do believe that these are some things that the West can do, should do, and do it in a continuous way and without any selectivity with regard to why they want to impose certain sanctions and how they would use that sanctions. They must have the human rights protections as a priority.
Thank you. That's very forthright. Pervez Hoodbhoy, the West has expressed the will, and how should it protect freedom to dissent?
By being scrupulously fair, it has to have very high moral credibility, which means whenever you see something wrong anywhere, speak out against it. Having said that, I think the real fight is here. We have to convince our own peoples, not just the government. And so, to me, it's very important to engage with the mullahs and the muftis here, difficult as it is. But I do try and engage with them whenever I get a chance on television. And they don't have a very strong wicket, you know. So that's really the challenge for me. But yes, since we're talking about the West, I agree with Hina that it has to be more, it has to do more, it has to be more proactive, it has to say that it will not compromise and that it will use the instruments available to it to see that what is right gets done.
Thank you. Taha, Siddiqui, you nailed down we nailed down in the discussion about them using embassies abroad to target people like yourselves. What else can the West do if it draws a red line there to protect freedom to dissent?
I think the other speakers here all mentioned very rightly. I mean, and I also discussed it earlier about how there should be some action taken against diplomatic missions involved in any malicious activity on foreign soil. But at the same time, I would like to particularly talk about just something that Pervez also mentioned about the FATF, which is a political instrument. But for the last 1.5 years, we've been seeing that Pakistan has been given time to continue doing performative actions and performative legislative actions in the country, where Hafiz Saeed right now is comfortably living inside his home, which has been declared a jail, and other such networks in the country continue to run counter terrorism funding. For example, the Afghan Taliban continue to collect funds in Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban also, we've heard, are regrouping and collecting funds in Pakistan, and the West or FATF has been giving Pakistan time again and again, saying that we will, you need to straighten up and you need to address the situation. But it's put Pakistan on a grey list, but not on a blacklist. I actually organized a protest here outside the FATF headquarters, after which a lot of Pakistani journalists came after me saying that why should you blacklist Pakistan? Why should you ask for blacklisting of Pakistan? But the idea is that after those blacklisting, there'll be sanctions or there'll be problems. But my thing is that the regime in the country, the Pakistani regime, the military hybrid regime, as we call it, that regime needs to be held responsible, and the West needs to stop, dilly-dallying here and there, and sort of, take concrete measures and send a strong message, especially with, for example, with the FATF, with the GSP Plus, with the European Union, and other sort of these measures that exist. They need to sort of, send a message. Now is the time. We've had enough. Pakistan, and then at the end of the day, it's really, really sad to see that people like General Bajwa, who's the army chief, are hosted abroad by different governments, by different Western governments. And these people are back home. They're killing people. They're abducting people. They're violating all kinds of human rights. And then they're welcomed by the West because the West needs some base in Pakistan, or the West needs some geostrategic positioning in Pakistan because of China or Iran or whatever. I mean, this kind of response, or this kind of sort of relationship with Pakistan, that needs to stop, and the West needs to really wake up.
Has the West lost its moral compass? Taha, could you take that as one of the younger generation in exile? Has the West lost its moral compass?
I'm not sure if morality is another debate of what morality means, or what moral compass would mean. But definitely the West has prioritized its economic interests over its human rights values, as I said before, and that's the biggest problem that we're seeing. Its economic and geopolitical interests are being overshadowed, are overshadowing its human rights values that existed in the past, and that needs to change.
Okay, Marcus, if I could just roll that onto you a bit, because we were talking about the government, we were talking about the big social media platforms, those big high-tech giants. That's private, that's economic, that's shareholders' interest, isn't it? Is there a moral compass there, or are they just going to do whatever makes them money?
Well, I certainly cannot speak for the platforms, and they don't get good press since a few years. So, but I think it's not the right approach to play out morality and human rights against economic interests, because then this allows governments to pursue these topics on two parallel tracks without connecting the dots. I think Western governments need to be aware of the fact that these authoritarian governments reaching into their territories also threatens security interests, rule of law, and liberal values here in our countries, and there needs to be more awareness on how this is entangled with our own security interests, and then there needs to be a firm response to this.
And that will be, whether it's private sector or government, that is going to be Western led, isn't it? I mean, that they will have to begin the regulations that stop the sort of practices we've been discussing.
Is that a question? Yeah.
It's a sort of common question. Yeah, just to sort
of... I mean, since many of people from these countries take refuge in Western societies, yes, it's the responsibility of the governments in these countries. Yes.
That's great. Thank you very much, everybody. We've got about 1 minute left, and I'd like to give Pervez his birthday question. In your role as a nuclear scientist and the Atomic Scientist Bulletin, the atomic clock is at the moment 2 minutes to midnight. We've been discussing lots of dystopian, catastrophic things here. Do you think it's going to stay there, move back, or move forward in the next year or so?
I don't see it moving backwards, but now I think that there is climate change which is competing with the threat of nuclear war. And in fact, it's perhaps the more immediate threat.
The climate change is a nuclear holocaust. The atomic clock, for those not familiar with it, is explain what it is, Pervez.
So this was started shortly after the Pugwash movement and the formation of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and it was the approach to doomsday. What if there is war between the Soviet Union and the United States? That would pretty much end much of civilization on Earth. How probable is it? Well, a group of scientists got together, and their consensus was to start it off some minutes before 12 a.m.
And it's crazy.
It's gone back and forth. It's come as close as 1 minute to midnight.
Oh, okay. Now we're at 2 minutes to midnight. And on that and that happy note, I have to say thank you to everybody for listening, for contributing. Thank you, Hina Jilani, Pervez Hoodbhoy, Taha Siddiqui, Marcus Michaelsen, Lord Charles Bruce, And Barry Gardiner's place, we thought he might not make it, is very empty. Next month, the Democracy Forum, 25th of August, the usual time, 2 o'clock British time. The title will be, Will the China-Russia Relationship Hold? Understanding Contradictions and Convergence. Will the China-Russia relationship hold? Tune in then for another instilling, insightful debate. But until then, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, from all our panel, and from the Democracy Forum, goodbye and stay safe.
Thank you very much.